Welcome to Power Play. Two of the most powerful governments on earth sat down together and decided to redesign the North American economy. They planned it quietly, they executed it boldly, and they made one catastrophic error. They forgot to account for the person who would be waiting on the other side of that decision when the news broke. That person was not who Washington expected, and by the time the White House realized what it had miscalculated, the response was already 6 moves deep and accelerating. This is not a story about diplomatic tension. It is not a story about trade policy in the abstract. It is a story about what happens when two governments, one American, one Chinese, construct a coordinated economic offensive against a country they assumed would absorb the blow quietly, and that country had spent 3 months building the counter-architecture before the first punch landed. The date is May 17th, 2026. The most consequential geopolitical miscalculation of the past week did not occur in the Strait of Hormuz, where 112 nations voted on a resolution that consumed the attention of most of the world's foreign policy press. It did not happen on the Zaporizhzhia front. It did not happen in the Security Council chamber or in any of the headline crises that dominated coverage in the days surrounding it. It happened in a building in Beijing, where the architecture of the most serious economic confrontation in North American history was drafted, and where one critical variable was left entirely out of the equation. Canada was not in that building. Canada was not notified. Canada was not given a phone call by its largest trading partner before that trading partner flew to the capital of its primary strategic competitor and agreed to arrangements designed with surgical precision to reduce Canadian industrial capacity, redirect Canadian export markets, and pull Canadian investment capital across the border into American territory. One White House advisor said it out loud. He said Canada was simply a country whose industrial prosperity could be kept at home in America instead of shared. That sentence was supposed to be private. It leaked within hours and appeared in every Canadian news organization before the day was out. Mark Carney read it in his briefings. Then he made 3 phone calls, not to Washington, to Tokyo, to Berlin, and to a third capital whose identity has not been publicly confirmed, but whose fingerprints are visible across everything that followed. 48 hours after Air Force One touchdown at Joint Base Andrews, Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa with no teleprompter and told the world that the misreading would be expensive. He was not performing. He was reporting on a strategy that was already in motion. And to understand why that strategy worked and why the most powerful government in the world has spent the weeks since then struggling to process what it failed to anticipate, you need to start 3 weeks before Trump ever boarded the plane for Beijing. 3 weeks before Trump's official arrival in Beijing, a quiet delegation departed Washington. No press coverage, no official schedule, no diplomatic announcement. The members traveled separately, checked into separate hotels, and met in a building that appeared on no public registry. 72 hours later, the framework of what would become the most economically aggressive move in the modern history of the Canada-US relationship had been drafted. Canada was not in the room. Canada was not on the agenda. On May 13th, the White House released the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, a 47-page policy document whose technical language contained an objective whose specificity pointed at exactly one country. Any company seeking maximum American federal tax incentives was required to locate all strategic production inside the United States, not North America, not USMCA territory. The United States: battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, and defense supply chain inputs. And then came Section 14, Paragraph 3. Companies relocating strategic production from a USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months, would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of existing incentives. Read that provision carefully. Washington was not simply encouraging domestic investment, it was actively subsidizing American companies to extract production capacity from Canada with a financial reward attached. To the speed of departure, the policy document was released on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Beijing and Washington announced $94 billion in Chinese agricultural purchasing agreements. Soybeans, beef, pork, wheat redirected overnight from Canadian suppliers to American ones. And then Trump stood before cameras in the Great Hall of the People and said 4 words that dominated Canadian media coverage for days afterward. Good runs end. 4 words. And then Canada answered, not with statements, with strategy. But to understand the depth and precision of that answer, you first need to understand exactly what was targeted and why. The specific industries named in the Manufacturing Priority Act tell you that the provision was not written by a generalist. It was written by someone who had studied the Canadian economic development agenda with enough precision to identify exactly where disruption would do the most structural damage. Ontario had invested more than $30 billion in electric vehicle infrastructure over the preceding years. Battery plants, component manufacturing lines, research corridors connecting university engineering departments to factory. Flows across the province. Economists were beginning to describe Ontario as the emerging EV capital of North America, a positioning that had been attracting international investment and building the kind of institutional momentum that takes years to accumulate. The Manufacturing Priority Act's targeting of battery manufacturing, EV components, semiconductor fabrication, and AI infrastructure was not a general statement about American industrial ambition. It was a targeted disruption instrument aimed at exactly the investment architecture that Ontario's EV strategy represented. Section 14's additional 15% credit for relocating out of a USMCA partner within 18 months was the accelerant applied directly to the materials those industries required, because Canada's lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth deposits are not incidental to the EV battery supply chain. They are its physical foundation. Attacking the investment in the processing and manufacturing layer while simultaneously redirecting investment capital away from the mining layer was a two-dimensional assault. The design was to leave Canada holding the raw materials while all the value-added production migrated south. A quarry instead of a supply chain partner, the $94 billion agricultural redirection is where the human dimension of the strategy becomes most visceral. Because these numbers translate directly into specific people's livelihoods in ways that corporate investment decisions, which work through quarters and years, cannot fully capture. Soybeans, $42 billion, beef, $18 billion, pork, $11 billion, wheat and feed grains, $23 billion. Canadian canola futures fell 11% in the first hour after the Beijing agreements became public. By noon, they were down 19%. A grain farmer outside Regina, 22 years of selling canola to Chinese buyers, sat in his truck in his own field for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to call his bank. He did not say he was angry. He said 2 words: "We are being replaced." Not 3 words, not 4, 2. And those 2 words captured something that futures market analysis cannot reach, what it feels like to be the mechanism through which 2 governments serve their mutual interests by redirecting flows that sustained your operation without a phone call, without a notification, without the basic acknowledgement that a century of economic integration might have entitled you to before the arrangement was concluded in your absence. Now, let's talk about what Canada actually sits on, underground, because the critical minerals dimension of this confrontation is where the strategy's deepest structural assumption is most exposed. and where that assumption was already being falsified by market dynamics that Washington had not fully modeled before committing to the approach. Canada holds some of the largest deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements on the planet. These are not optional inputs to the industries the Manufacturing Priority Act was designed to support. They are the physical materials without which batteries cannot be made, semiconductors cannot be fabricated, defense systems cannot be built, and renewable energy infrastructure cannot be installed at the scale of the energy transition, and requires. The global demand for these materials is not declining. It is accelerating at the rate that electrification of transportation, computing, and energy generation produces. China controls a large portion of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Australia and Canada together control a large portion of the world's lithium, nickel, and cobalt reserves. The manufacturing economies that need these materials, American battery manufacturing, American semiconductor fabrication, American EV component production, need Canadian materials to make those factories function regardless of where the factories are located. You can incentivize a factory to move to Texas. You cannot incentivize a lithium deposit to move to Texas. The policy moved the processing capacity south. The material it requires remained in the ground, in British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec. The Beijing agreements were designed to neutralize this leverage by redirecting Chinese investment capital away from Canadian mining projects and toward American mineral development, while accelerating American domestic mining through our emergency industrial authorities. Canadian mining stocks fell 14% in the week following Trump's return from Beijing. Two major lithium projects in British Columbia lost Chinese financing commitments almost immediately. An internal Canadian government assessment summarized the risk with the bluntness that classified documents allow. Canada was at risk of becoming a raw material supplier while all value-added production migrated south of the border. Not a partner in the supply chain, a quarry. That sentence, written by Canadian civil servants analyzing what had just been agreed in Beijing, describes the exact outcome the strategy was designed to produce. It arrived at Mark Carney's desk on the same day. He was already 40 hours into preparing the response. And here is where you need to understand precisely who Mark Carney is, because the response that followed was not the response Washington had modeled. And the reason it wasn't is directly, specifically, entirely about who this man is and what he has spent 30 years learning to do. Carney is not a politician who learned economics as a policy tool. He is an economist who spent 3 decades operating at the absolute apex of the global financial system before entering politics. Governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, guiding the country through the most severe global financial shock in generations with more precision and less institutional damage than any comparable advanced economy achieved in the same period. A governor of the Bank of England afterward, the first and only non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history, 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs, navigating the most complex financial negotiations that the private sector generates at the level where a single misplaced word costs billions and where the negotiators who have internalized that constraint are the ones whose stillness is more threatening than anyone else's most emphatic statement. A doctorate in economics from Oxford. He does not reach for outrage. He does not raise his voice in public. He moves with the specific stillness of someone who has spent a career in rooms where the person who shows urgency first has already lost something. The night the Beijing agreements became fully public, Carney did not call a press conference. He read every page of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, Section 14, Paragraph 3, every line of the Agricultural Contract Framework, every critical minerals investment redirection provision, 4 hours, and then 3 phone calls, Tokyo, Berlin, the third capital, not Washington. The omission of Washington from the initial call sequence was itself the first strategic communication. He was not going to Washington to negotiate from weakness. He was going to his other partners to build the alternative architecture that would determine his negotiating position before Washington had finished processing that its leverage assumption was incomplete. 48 hours after Air Force One touched down at Joint Base Andrews, Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. Maple leaf flags, 2 cameras, no teleprompter. He stood still for a moment while the room went completely quiet, and then he spoke with the precision of someone who had prepared every sentence and knew every sentence was accurate. Canada is not a bargaining chip. So 3 seconds of silence. Canada is not a concession in someone else's framework. Canada is not a line item negotiated in rooms where it was not invited to sit. Canada is not a country whose industrial future gets decided by bilateral arrangements designed in its absence. He paused. 3 days ago, the President of the United States sat in Beijing and agreed with the government that Canada has been diplomatically managing with careful consistency for decades to a set of arrangements explicitly designed to reduce Canada's manufacturing capacity, redirect Canada's export markets, and undermine Canada's investment environment. He did not consult us. He did not notify us. He did not extend the basic diplomatic courtesy that one nation extends to another after more than a century of alliance. And this morning, he posted on social media that Canada should fix its economy. He looked up from his notes. He looked directly into the camera. I want to respond to that clearly. Canada's economy does not need fixing by those who would dismantle it. It needs to be defended from those who treat partnership as a resource to be extracted and an alliance as a convenience to be discarded the moment a more profitable arrangement appears across the Pacific. He closed the folder. He did not look away from the camera. To those who believe Canada will absorb this quietly, that patience is the same as weakness, that restraint is the same as submission. 3 seconds of complete silence. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. That press conference was watched 47 million times in the first 24 hours. Trump's response arrived the following morning on Truth Social. Carney is all talk, no action. Canada's economy is a mess and he's giving speeches. Very weak. That characterization required revision by the end of the same week. Because while Trump was posting, the response was already executing 6 simultaneous coordinated moves that were not announced as a package, not framed as retaliation, and not presented as anything other than routine exercises of Canadian sovereign economic policy. Together, they constituted the most precisely organized economic counterpositioning by a middle-sized power against a superpower in modern diplomatic history. And every single one of them was in motion before Trump posted his response. Move 1. Canada formally notified the United States Trade Representative that it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically flagging Section 14's relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreements. Investment neutrality provisions, not framed emotionally, handled as a legal and procedural challenge. The USMCA is a binding international agreement that the United States drafted, negotiated, and signed. Its dispute resolution mechanisms exist precisely for situations where one party believes another has violated its investment provisions. Canada was invoking the agreement and Washington itself authored. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It is running, and every corporate legal team at every company evaluating the Section 14 relocation credit has now had to factor the review's outcome into its long-term investment. Calculus. Move 2. Canada announced an emergency expansion of its Critical Minerals Investment Authority, a new sovereign fund capitalized at $40 billion, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital that Beijing's agreement with Washington had redirected away from Canadian mining projects. This fund was not improvised in 48 hours. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not appear fully structured on that timeline unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were already prepared before the triggering events occurred. The British Columbia lithium projects that lost Chinese financing within days of the Beijing summit had alternative capitalization available within weeks. The preparation predated the trigger. Move 3. Canada announced a new bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-tracked manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for months, waiting for the political moment that would make its announcement both credible and urgent. The corridor had been under preparation since Carney's conversations with Berlin in the days preceding the Beijing summit. Conversations whose strategic purpose became fully visible when the framework was ready to announce within 72 hours of the triggering event. EU capital began moving toward Canadian industrial assets at the specific moment that American policy had created a discount in Canadian asset valuations. The discount was the opportunity. The corridor was the vehicle. The preparation was the advantage. Move 4. Canada signed preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply. 3 of the 4 economies whose industrial futures most urgently require a trusted alternative to Chinese-controlled mineral supply chains: Japan's automotive and electronics manufacturing, South Korea's semiconductor and battery production, Australia's own mining infrastructure complementing Canadian reserves. In a bilateral framework that positions the two countries as the democratic world's primary alternative to Chinese mineral supply dominance. The agreements were announced in sequence across the week following the Beijing summit, each one adding to the cumulative picture of an outward multilateral movement that directly contradicted the bilateral containment logic the Beijing agreements were built on. Move 5. Canada released a full economic impact assessment, whose specific numbers were designed for a specific audience, not voters, not journalists, but the boardrooms of companies evaluating the Section 14 relocation credit. The financial analysts covering North American industrials and the bond market participants pricing Canadian sovereign risk. The numbers were concrete and sourced from Statistics Canada and 3 independent economic research institutions, not from the Canadian government's own political communications. More than $800 billion in annual bilateral trade, 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains, 41% of total American crude oil imports from Canada, with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. These were not political arguments. They were material dependencies presented in the format that people making capital allocation decisions require before they can act on the information. The document was arithmetic presented to the people who read arithmetic most carefully, and it circulated to every relevant financial desk and corporate strategy office within days of publication. Move 6 was the one that produced the most immediate measurable results, and the one that required the most specific preparation to execute without it appearing to be what it was. Carney personally called the CEOs of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them and to inform them with complete specificity about what Section 14 relocation would cost them. In part, Canadian regulatory cooperation, Canadian resource access, and Canadian market participation. He was not issuing ultimatums. He was doing the math with them out loud, allowing each executive to perform for themselves. The calculation their own financial and legal teams would eventually deliver anyway, just faster and with more precision than the corporate process would have produced on its own timeline. When the calls were done, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing relocation reviews and pending further regulatory clarity. 3 others began internal reassessments that have not yet produced public announcements. One company proceeded and has since discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval Washington advertised has in practice involved closer to 4 years. Now, let's talk about what has happened in the weeks since. Because the secondary and tertiary effects of this confrontation are now producing outcomes that the initial framing completely failed to anticipate. The 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario within 48 hours of the Beijing announcements, relocating to Texas and Arizona, and pausing Canadian commitments indefinitely, 2 of them have quietly reinitiated conversations with their original Canadian partners. The reason is not sentiment. The reason is that the American regulatory reality behind the 90-day streamlined approval promise turned out to be the 4-year regulatory process that the relevant statutes actually mandate. So regardless of political preference, the Canadian infrastructure was already built, the Canadian workforce was already trained, and the Canadian supply chain connections were already operational. The $30 billion invested over years had produced a platform that could not be replicated in a new American location without the time and investment that erased the economic advantage the 15% additional credit was supposed to provide. The credit was large enough to generate the announcement. It was not large enough to make the full economics of actual relocation work. The agricultural contracts between Beijing and Washington redirected $94 billion in purchasing from Canadian to American suppliers. Canadian canola exports to China fell sharply. The futures price collapse on the day of the announcement was real. The farm-level economic pain was real. But within 30 days, Canada had accelerated negotiations with India and Indonesia to absorb the displaced volume at comparable price points. The agricultural export market diversification that the displacement forced Canada to execute has produced a more resilient export architecture than the single dominant buyer dependence that preceded the Beijing agreements. The pain was acute, and the structural result may be more durable than the arrangement. The disruption replaced 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the Beijing summit. Capital that had been observing Canadian assets with interest and waiting for the discount that the summit's investment uncertainty provided. Washington created the sale. The buyers who arrived were European, not American, and the strategic consequence of European sovereign capital holding significant positions in Canadian critical mineral production is a fundamentally different geopolitical outcome from the one the Beijing agreements were designed to produce. The agreements were supposed to leave Canada without the investment capital to develop its mineral assets, creating space for American domestic mining to position itself as the allied nation alternative. Instead, allied European capital entered Canadian mineral development, making Canada the critical mineral supplier of record for a significant portion of European, Japanese, Korean, and Australian industrial demand, while simultaneously giving those economies a direct financial stake in Canadian resource development that their own governments will defend in every subsequent trade negotiation. A Wall Street analyst note circulated at every major financial desk on 3 continents summarized the situation with the directness that financial sector communication uses when the data is clear. The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. The Beijing dimension of this confrontation carries a layer that almost no analysis of the situation is adequately addressing, which is what Beijing's own calculations look like in the weeks after the summit, and how the Canadian response has changed those calculations in ways that were not part of Beijing's pre-summit modeling. Beijing entered the summit with a specific theory about how Canadian responses to bilateral US-China arrangements would unfold. The theory was straightforward. Canada would negotiate defensively with Washington. trying to restore as much of the bilateral relationship as possible while absorbing the immediate economic impact of the redirected trade flows. The negotiation would be bilateral between Ottawa and Washington, and the resolution would involve Canadian concessions on the issues Washington had flagged as its priorities. That theory assumed Canada's response would be bilateral and reactive. What happened was multilateral and proactive. Canada moved outwards simultaneously, deepening relationships with Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Commonwealth at a pace that suggested the contingency planning had begun long before the Beijing announcements, and that the alternative architecture was designed to reduce Canadian dependence on both Washington's goodwill and Beijing's commercial relationships, rather than to restore either. A senior Chinese foreign policy official speaking privately to a journalist in Shanghai acknowledged that Beijing had underestimated the speed and scale of Canada's response and that the model of bilateral containment had produced immediate multilateral expansion. The model was wrong. That assessment reached Ottawa through the standard channels through which diplomatic assessments travel. Carney read it. He made one additional call to Canada's ambassador in Beijing. He said 4 words: keep the channel open. Meanwhile, the White House briefing room produced a moment that has since become the visual shorthand for the asymmetry in preparation between the two sides of this confrontation. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist asked the press secretary 3 questions in sequence. Had the administration calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses in the affected sectors? The answer was hedged. Had the administration reviewed Canada's economic impact assessment, showing 3.2 million American jobs tied directly to Canadian supply chains? The answer was non-committal. And finally, when the president said Canada's good run was over, was that the official position of this administration on the alliance? The press secretary paused, and the cameras stayed on. 4 seconds of silence, and then she moved to the next question, without answering. That 4-second pause spread across every major Canadian news organization that evening, played directly adjacent to Carney's Ottawa press conference. The contrast did not require commentary. One side had looked into a camera with no notes, no teleprompter, and said exactly what it believed, clearly, precisely, with the stillness of preparation rather than the urgency of improvisation. The other side had needed 4 seconds to decide what was permitted to be said, and then chose to say nothing. The silence was the answer, and the answer confirmed what Carney had said and what the strategy he was executing had already demonstrated. Now let's talk about U-Star Jameson Greer's congressional testimony, because the most honest available statement of what this confrontation is actually about came not from a diplomatic communique or a press conference, but from a congressional hearing where the trade representative had to answer questions under oath. Greer told lawmakers that Canada was doubling down on globalization when Washington was trying to correct for the problems of globalization. Read that sentence with the weight it requires. Not a complaint about steel dumping, not a concern about specific tariff rates. A statement about 2 fundamentally incompatible visions of how the global economy should organize itself. Washington's vision involves restructuring supply chains around national boundaries, redirecting investment through incentive architecture, and applying trade pressure to enforce commercial alignment with American industrial policy objectives. Canada's vision involves maintaining relationships with multiple commercial partners simultaneously, making trade decisions based on Canadian national interests, and accepting the friction with powerful allies that independent commercial judgment produces. These are not positions that can be resolved by adjusting a tariff rate by 10 percentage points. They are structural disagreements about the foundational architecture of how allied nations relate to each other. Commercially, in an era of great power competition, the Fortress North America concept is where Carney's position becomes most strategically nuanced. Carney has never closed the door on deeper North American economic integration. Ottawa has explicitly said it remains open to the concept of a jointly protected economic zone. That openness is genuine, it is on the record. But Fortress North America requires what any durable partnership requires: predictability, consistency, a partner whose position does not produce three completely contradictory communications about the same bilateral arrangement in 11 days. Washington expressed opposition to the January 2026 Canada-China agreement that dropped canola tariffs from 84% to 15%, then briefly suggested the deal was actually beneficial, then returned to opposition, 3 positions to 11 days. Every Canadian business or government body planning around American trade policy must now account for the possibility that the position communicated this week trade reverses next week in response to a domestic political development in Washington that has nothing to do with the bilateral relationship. That uncertainty is not manageable friction. It is a structural barrier to the deeper integration that Washington claims to be building toward. And the same pressure that was supposed to move Canada toward Fortress North America on Washington's terms may be undermining the very conditions necessary for Fortress North America to be politically sustainable within Canada on any terms. That is the structural contradiction at the heart of the strategy. And it is the contradiction that Carney, trained to identify systemic risk in financial architecture, recognized immediately, and that Washington's political operators, focused on bilateral leverage calculations, have not yet fully processed. Here is the full picture as of May 17, 2026. The North American Manufacturing Priority Act is law. Section 14, paragraph 3 is in effect. The $94 billion agricultural redirection is signed and operational. The farm-level pain is not abstract. The manufacturing investment uncertainty is not theoretical. The mining financing disruption is documented. Trump was bold in Beijing. That is real. And simultaneously, 7 of 11 American CEOs Carney called have paused relocation reviews. 2 of 3 Chinese battery manufacturers have reinitiated Canadian conversations. 3 European sovereign wealth funds have committed $22 billion to Canadian mining. Canada's mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia are signed. The EU industrial corridor is under construction. The USMCA compliance review has no resolution date. Canada's agricultural exports are diversifying to India and Indonesia, and the 3.2 million American jobs on the Economic Impact Assessment spreadsheet are a documented dependency that no Washington press briefing was able to address when the question was posed directly. Carney was ready in Ottawa. That is equally real. The manufacturing incentives are law. The compliance review is running. The good run comment is on the record. The 4-second pause is on tape. And the world that watched that 7 million view press conference and that White House briefing room silence is now in the process of determining whether the assumption underneath the Beijing strategy that Canadian patience was a form of weakness, that pressure would convert into capitulation, was an accurate read of the situation, or the most expensive misreading of a middle power's intentions and capabilities that a superpower has produced in this hemisphere in a very long time. If this analysis gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening in North American geopolitics right now. Like this video if you want more coverage at this depth. Subscribe to Power Play so you don't miss what comes next, because this confrontation is not over, and the next move is already forming.